The night search and rescue was too late. According to search and rescue, I should have been dead before sunrise. The strange part is that when they found me, someone had already helped me survive the night. I'm 47 years old. I've hunted the mountains of western Montana for almost 30 years. And I want to start by telling you that the man who walked into the backcountry that October morning was not a careless man. I want that on the record, because what happened to me afterward isn't a story about a fool who got what was coming to him. It's a story about a man who did almost everything right and still ended up in a situation that should have killed him. And it's a story about the part of that night I still cannot explain 6 years later, no matter how many times I've turned it over. I've run through every conventional explanation a careful, skeptical man could come up with, and none of them have ever fully closed the gap between what should have happened to me and what actually did. I've told this story exactly 3 times since it happened. Once to my wife, once to the search and rescue coordinator who found me, though I left out the part that mattered most, and once, a year later, to a man I trusted who'd had an experience of his own out in that same range, who listened without once telling me I was wrong. I'm telling it now, in full, for the first time, because I think 6 years is long enough to have decided I'd rather be honest than comfortable. So let me take you through it, exactly as it happened. The hunt. This was the 2nd week of October, 6 years ago, in a remote stretch of the Bitterroot Range I'd hunted on and off for close to 15 years. I knew this country well enough that getting badly lost there should have been close to the bottom of my list of realistic concerns that morning. I was hunting elk alone, which I'd done dozens of times without incident. My wife knew my route. I'd filed a plan with a ranger station, the way I always do. The forecast called for a clear day, weather moving in well after dark. That forecast would turn out to be wrong. I left my truck before first light, and by mid-morning had cut fresh sign. A bull moving unhurried, fresh enough that I could still smell where he'd bedded the night before. That kind of focus is the start of more backcountry incidents than almost anything else I could name. Not recklessness. Focus. The kind that quietly erodes everything except the next print in the dirt. I followed that sign for hours, off any trail I'd marked, deeper into a side drainage I'd been into only once or twice before. Each time I told myself I'd turn back at the next ridge. Each time, the sign pulled me one drainage further. By early afternoon, I made a decision I have replayed in my mind more times than any other decision of my adult life. I kept going. The turn I told myself I had hours of daylight left, that I knew, roughly, the direction back to my truck, that one more push was a reasonable risk for a man with my experience. All of those thoughts were true, individually. Together, they were the beginning of the worst night of my life. By mid-afternoon, a front moved in faster than forecast, the kind of discrepancy any experienced outdoorsman has hit before and learned never to fully trust. By late afternoon, low cloud had settled into that drainage, thick enough to erase the ridge lines I'd been using to orient myself, the way fog erases everything in real mountain country, not gradually, but all at once. That's the last clear memory I have of feeling like a man still in control of his own situation. The realization, I did what 30 years of experience trains you to do. I stopped moving, pulled my compass, and tried to reconstruct my path using dead reckoning, a skill I'd relied on dozens of times before. It didn't work the way it should have. I'd crossed at least one drainage I hadn't fully accounted for, distracted by focus in exactly the way I just described. The fog made every slope indistinguishable from the last. By the time real darkness started to settle in, I had to admit something 30 years in that backcountry had never once forced me to admit before. I did not know where I was, and I was not going to find my way back before nightfall. That admission is the hinge point of this entire story. Everything before it was an ordinary hunting trip with an unfortunate ending in progress. Everything after it became something I still don't fully understand. The first hours of dark. I want to walk you through exactly what I did because I think the details matter, and because this is the part of the story where most people assume the worst mistakes happen. They don't, usually. The worst mistakes happen earlier, in decisions like the one I made that afternoon. By the time real darkness sets in, an experienced person is mostly just managing the consequences of those earlier choices as well as they can. I had a day pack with me, not my full overnight kit, because I hadn't planned to be out past dark. Water, a little food, a knife, a basic fire kit, a space blanket I carry on every trip regardless of length, a habit built from 30 years of watching other people's near misses become lessons I never wanted to learn the hard way myself. I found a stand of timber that offered some shelter from the wind, built a rough lean-to from deadfall and my space blanket, and managed, despite damp conditions, to get a small fire going. I want you to remember that fire, because it's going to matter again soon, in a way I never expected. I settled in for what I told myself would be an uncomfortable but survivable night. I'd done emergency overnights before, on guided trips that went sideways, on hunts that ran longer than planned. I knew, intellectually, that a single cold night alone in the backcountry, properly managed, was rarely fatal on its own. I'd told other people that exact reassurance more times than I could count in my years guiding, and I believed it as much as I'd ever believed anything. What I didn't know yet was that this particular night was going to test every piece of that knowledge, and that something else, something I had absolutely no framework for, was going to become part of how I survived it. The cold sets in. I want to be honest with you about how quickly things changed once full dark arrived, because I think the honesty matters more than making myself sound more capable than I actually was that night. The temperature dropped faster than I'd expected, even accounting for elevation and the front that had moved in. My space blanket and small fire were doing less than I needed them to do. I was wearing layers appropriate for a day hunt, not an unplanned night exposed to genuine mountain cold, and within a couple of hours, I could feel that difference in a way that worried me more than I wanted to admit to myself. I want you to understand what early hypothermia actually feels like, because it's not what most people imagine. It's not a dramatic collapse. It's a slow, creeping argument your body has with itself, shivering that won't fully stop, a fog settling over your thinking that you recognize, intellectually, as dangerous, even as it makes recognizing danger harder by the minute. Your hands stop working the way you need them to. Simple tasks, feeding a fire, checking a knot, take 3 times as long and twice the concentration they should. I fed my fire as carefully as I could, rationing the deadfall I'd gathered, aware that I'd need it to last as long into the night as possible, and aware, with the cold clarity that sometimes survives even as everything else starts to blur, that I might not have gathered enough. I remember doing the math more than once, counting pieces, trying to stretch hours I didn't have enough fuel to actually stretch. I want to tell you exactly what I thought. Somewhere in the deepest, coldest part of that night, because I think it matters more than almost anything else I'm going to tell you. I thought I wasn't going to see morning. I was wrong, though not in any way I could have predicted sitting there in the dark. The moment I remember most clearly I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that 6 years of distance hasn't made any easier to describe. Sometime well past midnight, I couldn't tell you the exact hour, because by then my sense of time had started to come apart, along with everything else. I remember my fire burning low, lower than I'd planned to let it get, and I remember the particular kind of fear that comes with watching your last reliable source of warmth shrink in front of you, while your body has already started arguing with itself about whether it's worth the effort to keep shivering. I remember thinking, with a clarity that still unsettles me, about my wife, about the conversation she was going to have with people, the one where she'd have to explain why I hadn't come home from a mountain I'd hunted for 15 years without serious incident. I thought about her finding out secondhand, from a ranger or a coordinator, instead of from me. And that thought alone did something to me that the cold hadn't managed to do on its own. I remember closing my eyes at some point, not deciding to sleep exactly, but losing the fight to stay fully conscious, the way you do when your body starts prioritizing survival functions over the parts of you that want to stay alert. And I remember, in a fragment I still can't fully place in time, hearing something that did not belong to the wind. The sound in the dark. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only kind of evidence I have to offer you, and I think exaggeration would cheapen something that deserves better than that from me. It was a sound of movement, heavier and slower than anything I associated with deer or elk moving through brush at night. A sound with long pauses built into it, like whatever was making it had no particular reason to hurry. My first thought, the only thought that made sense to an experienced Montana hunter half-conscious from cold, was bear. We have grizzlies in that range, and even though most are well into denning behavior by October, exceptions happen, and exception was the only category my mind had room for in that moment. I don't remember reaching for my rifle. I want to be honest about that, because I think it tells you something important about the state I was actually in by that point in the night. I was past the kind of clear, tactical thinking that 30 years of experience usually gives a man in a dangerous situation. I was a man whose body had already started making peace with not surviving the night, hearing something move in the dark, and simply not having the resources left to do anything but listen. The sound came closer. Then it stopped. I remember straining to hear past my own heartbeat, certain that whatever had stopped moving was now standing somewhere just past the reach of my firelight, deciding something I had no way of influencing one way or the other. I don't know how long I sat there, certain something was just beyond the reach of my dying firelight, before I lost consciousness completely. What I do know is that I woke up at some point well before dawn, and the fire that I distinctly remembered burning down to almost nothing was burning again, steady and full in a way it had no business doing on its own. The fire that shouldn't have been burning. I want you to understand exactly how strange this moment was for me, because I think it's easy, hearing it secondhand, to underestimate just how specific and certain my memory of this particular detail is, even 6 years later. I had been managing that fire carefully for hours, watching the deadfall I'd gathered shrink, rationing pieces in a way that meant I knew, almost to the log, how much fuel I had left and roughly how long it would last. When I lost consciousness, that fire was low. The kind of low that meant it had maybe 20-30 minutes left before it went out entirely. When I woke, it was burning the way a fire burns when someone has just fed it a substantial amount of new fuel. Flames higher than I'd had them in hours. The kind of heat I could actually feel reaching me through the cold for the first time since early evening. For one confused, grateful moment, I simply sat there, absorbing that warmth, without questioning where it had come from. The way you accept a gift before your mind catches up to ask who gave it to you. Then the question caught up to me, and the warmth stopped feeling entirely like a gift. I looked around for the source of that fuel, still fogged with cold and exhaustion, and found a stack of additional deadfall near the edge of my small camp that had not been there before I lost consciousness. Branches I hadn't gathered myself, arranged in a way that suggested someone had been selective about size and dryness, the kind of selection an experienced person makes when they understand fire, not the kind of pile you'd get from something simply knocking branches down by accident. I did not gather that wood. I want to say that as plainly as I can. I have no memory of doing it. And given my physical state at that point in the night, I do not believe I had the capacity to do it, even if some part of my memory has simply failed to retain it. I sat there, warmer than I had any right to be, staring at wood I hadn't gathered, and I understood, in a way that went past fear into something closer to disorientation, that I was not as alone out there as I had believed. What I found next. I want to tell you that the fire was the strangest thing that happened to me that night. It wasn't. Sometime after the fire had been built back up, I genuinely don't know how much time passed, because my sense of time had not fully recovered. I noticed something near the edge of my shelter that I hadn't put there myself. It was food. Specifically, several handfuls of what I'd later identify as service berries, slightly past peak season but still edible, sitting on a flat piece of bark near the entrance of my lean-to, arranged in a way that struck me immediately as deliberate rather than accidental. Not scattered the way something dropped or knocked loose would scatter. Gathered into a small, deliberate pile, the kind a person makes when they intend for something to be found and eaten, not stumbled over by chance. I want to give you the rational explanation first, because I think it deserves serious consideration. It's possible, in a state of exhaustion and cold-induced confusion, that I gathered those berries myself and have no memory of doing so. Memory failures under extreme physiological stress are well documented, and I don't want to oversell the mystery of something that might have a mundane explanation. But I want to tell you why that explanation has never fully satisfied me. I hadn't seen serviceberry bushes anywhere near where I'd made camp. I'd been specifically looking for any edible plant in the hours before full dark, the way you do when you're aware your situation might extend longer than you'd planned, and I had found nothing in that immediate area worth picking. I'd actually commented to myself out loud how barren that particular stretch of timber was for anything edible at all. I ate them anyway. Whatever questions I had about where they'd come from, I was cold and exhausted and aware enough of basic survival principles to know that calories, any calories, mattered more in that moment than caution. It would not be the last unexplained thing I found near that shelter before the night was over. The shelter. I want to walk you through this next part carefully, because it's the detail that, more than any other, has made it impossible for me to fully accept the mundane explanations I've spent 6 years trying to talk myself into believing. At some point in the deepest, darkest stretch of that night, after the fire, after the berries, in a period of time I genuinely cannot place with any confidence, I lost consciousness again, more completely than before. I have no memory at all of what happened during that stretch. What I remember next is waking to find that my lean-to, the simple structure I'd built myself out of deadfall and a single space blanket, had changed. It had been reinforced. Additional branches, larger and heavier than anything I'd had the strength to gather by that point in my exhaustion, had been woven into the existing frame in a way that noticeably improved its coverage against the wind. The kind of structural improvement that requires both strength and a working understanding of how shelter actually functions against weather, not random branches knocked into a pile by accident or by some animal passing through. I did not do this. I want to say that as plainly and as honestly as I can. I did not have the physical capacity left in me by that point in the night to gather and place material of that size, and even setting capacity aside, I have absolutely no memory of doing any part of it. I ran my hand along those new branches more than once, the way you check something is real when your mind is telling you it shouldn't be. They were solid, cold to the touch, the way wood gets after sitting out in October air, which told me they hadn't simply fallen there moments before I woke. Whatever had placed them had done so some time ago, while I lay there unaware. I sat there in the gray light just before dawn, staring at a shelter I hadn't finished, warmed by a fire I hadn't rebuilt, having eaten food I hadn't gathered, and I understood, with a certainty that has never fully left me in 6 years since, that something had been at my camp while I was unconscious, close enough to touch the structure I was sleeping inside, close enough to feed a fire inches from where I lay, and I hadn't woken for any of it. I didn't know, in that moment, whether that realization was the most frightening thing that had happened to me out there, or the reason I was still alive to have the realization at all. At the time, I thought the shelter was the strangest thing I was going to have to explain about that night. I was wrong. The ring. I want to tell you about something I noticed that morning in the gray light just after I'd discovered the shelter, because it's a detail that has nothing to do with the fire, or the food, or the branches woven into my lean-to. It's a separate thing entirely, and out of everything that happened that night, it's the one piece I have never been able to fit into any explanation, mundane or otherwise. Snow had started falling sometime after midnight, light at first, just a dusting, but enough that by the time real light came up, a thin layer covered the ground around my camp, except in one place. There was a rough, uneven ring around my shelter, maybe 8 or 9 feet out from where I'd been lying, where the ground was bare. Not trampled, not packed down the way snow gets when something walks across it repeatedly. Just clear, like the snow simply hadn't been allowed to settle there at all, while everything beyond that ring, and everything inside the small footprint of my own camp, carried a normal, even dusting like the rest of the drainage. I remember crouching down at the edge of that bare ring, running my fingers along where the clear ground met the dusted snow, looking for some kind of boundary I could explain. A windbreak, a heat source, anything. I didn't find one. I didn't think much about it in the moment, if I'm honest. I had bigger questions occupying me by that point in the morning. The fire, the food, the shelter. I logged the ring mentally, the way you log any unusual detail when your mind has too many other things competing for its attention. And I moved on. I would think about that ring a great deal more in the weeks that followed, once I learned something about it that I still don't have a satisfying explanation for. What I heard before dawn. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened before the sun came up, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after, even though, like so much of this story, it resists a clean explanation. In the gray light just before true dawn, sitting there processing what I'd just discovered about my shelter, I heard movement again. The same quality of movement I'd heard hours earlier. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried, somewhere in the timber just beyond the range of my newly rebuilt fire. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think it tells you something important about where my head was by that point. I called out. Not words exactly, more of a raw, exhausted sound, somewhere between a question and a plea, the kind of thing that comes out of a person who has stopped being able to fully separate fear from gratitude. Nothing answered. The movement paused, then resumed, moving away rather than closer, fading into the timber in a direction I couldn't have told you with any confidence even immediately afterward. I never saw it. I want to be completely clear about that, because I think it's the single most important fact in this entire story, and I don't want to let the drama of everything else obscure it. In 6 years of turning this night over in my mind, I have never once claimed to have seen, clearly with my own eyes, whatever it was that fed my fire, left me food, and rebuilt my shelter while I lay there unconscious. What I have is the evidence it left behind. And that evidence is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. The morning, by the time real light came up that morning, I felt different than my physical condition had any right to allow. Not strong, I want to be clear about that. I was still in genuine danger, dehydrated, undernourished, suffering from the kind of exposure that would later require real medical attention. But something in me had shifted overnight, in a way I can't fully attribute to rest alone, given how little actual sleep I'd gotten in any conventional sense. I made the decision to move, and I want to tell you honestly that the direction I chose felt more certain to me than anything had felt since I'd first admitted I was lost. I don't know if that certainty came from some half-buried terrain association finally surfacing, exhaustion clearing just enough to let old memory through, or from something else I have no framework for explaining. I walked for what I'd estimate was close to 2 hours, slower than I would have liked, stopping often, my body reminding me with every step how close to its limit it actually was. More than once, I caught myself glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something behind me on the trail, though there was never anything there when I looked. I also found myself, more than once on that walk, looking down at my own boot prints in the thin snow behind me, half-consciously checking them against the memory of that bare ring around my camp. I couldn't have told you what I was looking for. I just couldn't stop looking. And then, for the first time since the previous afternoon, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the forest at all. A helicopter, somewhere to the southeast, running a search pattern. I wouldn't understand until much later just how much that final walk toward the sound of that helicopter would end up mattering to the people trying to piece together what actually happened to me. The rescue, I made it to a clearing wide enough to be visible from the air, though I want to be honest that I'm not entirely certain I chose that clearing through deliberate navigation alone. There was a quality to that final stretch of walking that felt less like decision-making and more like simply not resisting a direction that had already been chosen for me. I don't say that to dramatize it. I say it because it's the most honest description I have of how that walk actually felt from the inside. I collapsed not long after reaching that clearing. I remember the helicopter passing once without seeing me. I remember very little after the second pass, until I woke up surrounded by a search and rescue ground team that had been dropped in to search the area on foot, with a paramedic checking vitals I'm told were significantly more concerning than I felt in the moment. The lead coordinator on that team told me something afterward that has stayed with me as much as anything else from that entire experience. Based on my documented physical condition as they found me, core temperature, hydration, the visible signs of prolonged exposure, he told me, directly and without hesitation, that I should not have survived that night. He didn't know yet about the fire. He didn't know about the berries. He didn't know about the shelter. He was simply talking about the cold, the way any experienced rescue professional talks about the brutal, indifferent math of exposure survival. I didn't correct him in that moment. I'm not sure I had the strength to, even if I'd wanted to. What search and rescue found later bothered me even more than anything the coordinator said that first day. The evidence. I want to tell you about what happened after I'd been stabilized, because this is the part of the story that exists independently of my own account, the part that other people documented without my needing to convince them of anything. Before the team extracted me, one of the younger search and rescue members, a man who'd grown up hunting that same range, asked permission to hike back toward my overnight camp while the rest of the team prepared me for transport. He returned roughly 45 minutes later, noticeably quieter than when he'd left, and had a brief, private conversation with the lead coordinator before either of them said anything to me directly. I noticed that conversation even through the haze I was in by that point, the two of them stepping a short distance away, the younger man's hands moving as he described something, the coordinator's expression shifting from professional patience into something closer to genuine uncertainty. Neither of them showed me anything in that moment. I had to wait, like everyone else who eventually heard this story, to find out exactly what he'd seen. I saw what he'd found about a week later, when the coordinator finally agreed to share it with me in full. There were tracks near my shelter. Large tracks, significantly larger than any boot print, with a stride length that didn't match a man walking, even accounting for the soft ground they'd been pressed into. There was also a partial set of similar tracks near the remains of my fire, close enough to the edge that whatever made them had been standing within arm's reach of where I'd been lying unconscious. I want to be careful here, the way I've tried to be careful throughout this entire story. Tracks in soft ground degrade quickly, distort under their own weight, can look larger or stranger than the animal that actually made them. I understand that, and I've held it in mind every time I've looked at the photographs the coordinator eventually shared with me. But nobody on that team, not the young man who found them, not the coordinator who'd spent 2 decades doing that job, offered me a confident explanation for what those tracks actually were. There was something else, too. Something that, to this day, never made it into any official document. And something the coordinator only told me reluctantly, a week later, almost as an afterthought. The coordinator told me, almost reluctantly, during that same conversation, that the young team member had also photographed the ring of bare ground around my camp before the snow melted off entirely. He told me they'd measured it, out of simple professional thoroughness, the way you document anything unusual at a scene, regardless of whether you understand it. The ring measured close to 9 feet across, fairly consistent on all sides, with no break in its edge anywhere they could find. He also told me, in a tone I can only describe as carefully neutral, that the radius of that ring was close enough to a known wingspan measurement, the kind used in raptor identification guides for some of the largest birds in that ecosystem. That one of his more skeptical colleagues had tried, only half seriously, to explain it as some kind of enormous bird having settled briefly over my camp. The coordinator told me he hadn't found that explanation satisfying either, given that nothing in that ecosystem gets anywhere close to that size, and given that nothing about a bird settling explains why the snow simply hadn't accumulated there in the first place, rather than being disturbed by something landing. Nobody cast the tracks in plaster. Nobody brought in a wildlife specialist. The official incident report, and I have a copy of it, the same flat, procedural document that thousands of unremarkable wilderness incidents get filed under every year, lists my survival as a successful application of basic survival skills, under extreme conditions, with a single brief note acknowledging unidentified animal tracks of unusual size in the vicinity of the subject's overnight camp. The ring isn't mentioned at all. I asked the coordinator about that omission directly, and he told me plainly that there was no category on the form for it, and no way to write it up that wouldn't invite questions he didn't have answers for. That sentence about the tracks is the entire official record of everything I've just told you. The ring exists only in a handful of photographs nobody outside that small team has ever seen, and in my own memory of crouching at its edge, looking for a boundary that simply wasn't there to find. Why I'm telling you this now. I didn't share the full version of this story publicly for almost 6 years. Part of that was professional caution. I still occasionally guide hunts in that same range, and there's no faster way to undermine a guide's credibility than attaching his name to a story like this one. Part of it, honestly, was that I genuinely wasn't certain, for a long time, how much of my own account I fully trusted, given how compromised my judgment was by the worst part of that night. I've held every conventional explanation up against my own memory more times than I can count, and I think any honest telling of this story has to give those explanations real weight. Cold and exhaustion can distort memory in ways that are well documented. It's possible I gathered that firewood myself, in a state my mind simply didn't retain. It's possible the berries were something I found and forgot finding. It's possible the tracks belonged to an unusually large bear, in conditions that made an animal gait read as something stranger than it actually was. Even the ring might have a mundane cause I simply don't have the expertise to identify. Some quirk of heat retention in the ground, some microclimate effect around a dying fire that neither I nor anyone on that search and rescue team happened to recognize. I take all of that seriously. I'm not interested in handing you a clean answer I don't actually have, because I think stories like this one lose something important the moment they start sounding more certain than the person living through them actually was. I'd rather you walk away from this with real doubt than with false confidence in either direction. But I also know, in order, exactly what I experienced across that single night, and I know that trained search and rescue professionals independently documented physical evidence afterward that none of them could fully explain either. A fire that rebuilt itself while I was unconscious. Food I never gathered. A shelter reinforced beyond my physical capacity to reinforce it myself. Tracks close enough to where I'd been lying that nobody could attribute to any known animal in that range. And a ring of bare ground around my own camp that snow simply refused to settle on, measured and photographed by professionals who never found a satisfying explanation for it either. I don't know what was out there with me that night. I genuinely don't, and I've made what peace I can with not having a definitive answer to offer you. What I do know is this. I went into those mountains a confident, experienced hunter who believed, the way most experienced people in that line of work believe, that he understood the real risks and the real limits of what lived in that backcountry. I came out of it a man who understands, with a certainty that has never once wavered in 6 years, that something was close enough to me that night to touch the fire I was sleeping beside, close enough to rebuild the shelter over my unconscious body, and chose, for reasons I will never fully understand, not to do anything but help. Some nights, when I'm out in that same general country on a guided hunt, leading clients through timber that looks almost exactly like the timber I camped in that October, I find myself glancing toward the tree line a little longer than the moment requires. I've never told a single client why. I doubt I ever will. There's one more thing I haven't told you yet, and I've saved it for last because it's the detail that, even now, unsettles me more than anything else in this story. About 2 years after that night, I went back to that same drainage, alone, during a stretch of country I was scouting for a client's hunt the following season. I hadn't planned to visit the exact site of my old camp. I'm not entirely sure I could have found it on purpose if I'd tried. But something about the terrain pulled me toward it anyway, the same way the morning after that night had pulled me toward the clearing where I was found. I found the spot. I'm fairly confident it was the same spot, the same configuration of deadfall, the same angle of slope, close enough to certain that I stood there for a long time before I let myself accept it. And in the bark of a lodgepole pine, at the edge of where my shelter had stood, At a height well above where any man could reach standing flat-footed on the ground, there were claw marks. 4 parallel grooves, deep enough to have scarred well into the heartwood, healed over with 2 years of growth, spaced in a way that didn't match any animal in that ecosystem, capable of reaching that high off the ground. I'm not going to tell you what I think made those marks. I don't know. I took photographs of my own that day, on my own phone, and I still have them. I've shown them to exactly 2 people. Neither one had an answer for me either. I don't know who or what got me through that night. I only know that, according to every piece of evidence search and rescue gathered afterward, I shouldn't have made it to morning on my own. Not the cold, not my gear, not 30 years of experience. None of it should have been enough on its own to get a man through a night like that. And somehow I did.